Okay, so talking about different types of seeds that we have. The main type of plant, I guess where all other plants originated from, is wild plants. So every domesticated plant that we grow, from carrots all the way to watermelons, started with an ancestor that was a wild plant. Now, wild plants are very, wild. They're hard to predict what's going to go on with them in most cases, and they have special germination requirements, meaning that they might have certain practices that you need to do in order to get them to grow in a greenhouse. So one of the characteristics of a lot of wild plant seed is dormancy. Dormancy means that the seed will not grow if you put it into soil immediately in most cases. Usually dormancy it has a either cold requirement, meaning in this region, native wild plants that we have need to go through a cold period in order for them to start to grow. So if you harvest a seed from say a dandelion plant and you want it to grow, it might not always grow as soon as you put it in the soil. You might have to leave it in a cold and moist environment, which is below 38 degrees to 35 degrees, and you have to leave it in that environment for about 2+ months usually. So 2 or 3 months in the cold. That will trick the plant into thinking that it's gone through a winterized period. So it's passed through winter, and then it's in the spring when you take the plant out of the cold treatment and you put it into a warm room temperature growing environment. It thinks that spring is there and you can actually start it to grow. So a lot of wild plants have that dormancy, and the process of cooling or chilling the seed and bringing it back up into growing temperatures is called cold stratification. The other aspect of wild plants is they have variable genetics. So some, if you have a batch of seeds, say 100 of them, out of that 100, maybe you'll get 20 tall ones and 30 short ones, and then the other 50 will be somewhere in the middle. They might vary from in color of the flower, the foliage, and the vigor of the plant. So some plants may be stronger and others might be weaker. Variable genetics is important for wild populations of plants to survive because if you have a bunch of plants with different genetics, certain ones will survive better in certain conditions, and with nature being what it is, you don't have the same exact conditions year after year, so it helps to have a variation in genetics so that your population will survive in the wild. Moving on to domesticated species, these are species of plants that have been grown by human beings for a long period of time, usually, or intensively bred. So humans took wild plants and they selected for certain characteristics that are advantageous to humans. So they may be food production, maybe have less fur on the leaves, so that you can actually eat it. So like wild mustard, which is a weed, you'll see has very thick bristles on the leaves, and domesticated mustard, like mustard greens or even broccoli rabe, is a type of mustard. There's very little to no fur on or bristles on the leaves, so that it's palatable. You can actually eat it and not have little bristles sticking in your gums. So the other reason we domesticate plants is for its appearance. It may have showier flowers. It may have better seeds that we can save as grain. They may be plants that are good for fiber or for dye. There's many reasons that we domesticate plants and find them preferable when the genetics are similar. So if you're growing a cucumber, for example, you don't necessarily want that cucumber to have fruits that are large and small and all different sizes. You want uniform fruit, so you know what you're getting year after year. This is that's part of the domestication process, is to stabilize the genetics. The other aspect of all domesticated plants, as a function of just growing them, is you get uniform germination. So as opposed to wild plants that have dormancy, domesticated plants usually do not have dormancy, so any dormancy that was in that population in the wild gets bred out. We select for plants that don't need to be put into a refrigerator for 2 months before we can grow them. We usually want plants that we can just throw the seed into the soil and it will grow within a week or two. So that's the uniform germination part. Most of your vegetables, when you put them in the soil, will start to sprout within a week or two. The other aspect of domesticated plants is it's easier to save the seeds. So wild plants have more. They have more of an incentive to disperse their seeds. So when their seeds ripen, usually they'll fall right off the plant and either be taken by the wind or fall on the ground or be scattered. Some wild plants will even shoot their seeds off when they're ripened. A lot of the bean family does that. Domesticated plants tend to hold on to their seeds tighter. The seed pods or the structures that hold the seeds are usually not very brittle and usually need to be beaten or rubbed or crushed in order to release the seeds. And that comes from the natural practice of saving seeds. Domesticated plants usually hold their seeds better so that people will select them and grow them. So those are two actually good advantages of growing domesticated plants. So out of domesticated plants you have two types. You have hybrids and heirlooms. So a hybrid plant is a plant that's been specifically bred for very specific traits, such as they're going to have very consistent characteristics because they've been inbred. Actually, there's actually two lines of plants that are inbred. It's kind of a complicated process to make hybrids, which is why only specific plant breeders do it. Your home gardener or community gardener is not usually going to make a hybrid plant, but it's something that you can do if you really wanted to. That's a little beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But when you make a hybrid plant, you inbreed two lines of plants and you get one generation of plants that has very consistent characteristics. Yield is one of them. So if a hybrid line of plants like this pepper here, the hybrid bell pepper has a consistent yield. It's going to give you a certain poundage of fruits per plant. It's going to have certain disease resistance. This one, for example, it doesn't say what the disease resistance is, but a lot of hybrid plants are made that way because they're resistant to plants. You'll find a lot of, in the squash family, the hybrids are usually resistant to verticillium or fusarium wilt, like fungal diseases. It's very important to have that resistance in certain sites. And the color and appearance of the fruits or the leaves are going to be very consistent. You know, for this pepper, you're going to get nice big red bell peppers. One other aspect that I didn't mention is the days to maturity, which we'll cover later, but usually hybrid plants will all ripen at about the same time. You won't have a variation in when those plants ripen. Now, heirloom plants are kind of the opposite of hybrids. They're not intensively bred, meaning that the plant lines are not inbred and crossed especially. They're usually open pollinated, which means that if you have, say, an heirloom tomato, the natural insect pollination amongst plants is responsible for that plant's pollination. Basically, it's responsible for the fertilization of the plant, and the offspring of that plant will be the same as the one that you started with. Hybrids do not have that characteristic. They will only be consistent for one generation, and then the next generation, if it's open pollinated, will have all sorts of different characteristics, and the plants won't be as strong. An heirloom plant has what's called stable genetics, so that when it's open pollinated, the next generation will have pretty much the same characteristics as the parental generation. The other quality that makes heirlooms is that the varieties have usually been grown for more than 50 years. So these are old varieties. A lot of them are from the 20s and 30s and 40s when home gardening was a very important industry, actually. A lot of vegetables, most vegetables were grown at home, and it wasn't grown on an industrial scale up until the 50s, when they started developing very good hybrids, and then vegetable production went into larger farms. So these heirloom varieties, actually, a lot of them were lost because of the new hybrids that came out, and we're starting to rediscover a lot of the heirlooms, which usually have better qualities as far as fruit flavor and diversity and appearance and the texture of the fruits, in particular with tomatoes. But the problem is they usually have shorter shelf life. They are not easily transported and shipped, and usually you have to pick them off the vine to get the best results for heirlooms. So they're not as commercially viable, which is why they've kind of gone almost extinct. But they're still great plants to grow, and they're very interesting to grow and look at. And the best part is you can save the seed from year to year, so you don't have to actually buy it. You can keep those seeds. The one exception to the stable genetics in heirlooms is if you're growing multiple varieties of a species together, like different varieties of tomato or squash together, you might experience cross-pollination, which will not give you the same heirloom, but it can be kind of cool to see what happens when two different heirloom varieties cross-pollinate, and you'll come up with something completely different and new, which will still be, good to eat. So that part of it can be fun, but if you want to keep an heirloom variety the same, you want to keep that plant or that group of plants in isolation. But that goes into seed saving, which is another topic, so we're not going to go too far into that. There's another category of seeds. They're called GMO or transgenic plants, and you don't typically see those types of plants in home gardens. They're more for industrial agriculture, and those plants are genetically engineered in laboratories, and they are mostly used in, like I said, in industrial agriculture, planted on a large scale, and they are not hybrids. Hybrids are different. Hybrids are created through traditional plant breeding, but in GMOs, what they do is they'll actually take genes from other species or from that are developed from, some of them genes are even from bacteria, and they're put into the seed, the genetic material of the seed, to make them resistant to certain diseases or to manufacture their own pesticides. Or some plants, like known as Roundup Ready plants, are engineered so that they can be sprayed with Roundup and not die, but it'll kill the weeds. So you're not usually going to come across those types of plants, but don't be scared off by the hybrid label, because hybrids are not GMOs. Heirloom plants are definitely not GMOs, and you're probably not going to come across them